The Druze in southern Syria are under threat. Their villages are being shelled. The only land they've ever known is turning on them. And they've issued a desperate plea, not to the UN, not to their Arab neighbors, but to Israel. And Israel is responding. The time couldn't be more volatile. For months, whispers of a potential Israel-Syria peace deal had begun to surface. Now, that dream is quickly fading. Because this isn't just about politics, it's personal. Israeli citizens are demanding that their government act to protect their families across the border in Syria, in what is still officially an enemy state. So who are the Druze, and why is Israel risking a military confrontation with Syria to protect them? Syria has been through over a decade of armed uprising and a ruthless crackdown. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives. Millions have been displaced. And although the worst fighting has quieted in recent years, the country is still in chaos. Hostility continues to simmer, especially between different religious and ethnic groups who have long had tensions beneath the surface. And right now, one of the groups caught in the middle is a small religious minority called the Druze, who live in southern Syria. Recently, some local Bedouin tribes in the area have accused the Druze of attacking their communities. Now, the Bedouin are calling for revenge, and those threats have turned into clashes on the ground. Although the Syrian military has tried to impose a shaky ceasefire, many Druze don't feel protected. Because Syria's new military is filled with the very Bedouins seeking vengeance. And that's where Israel comes in. In recent weeks, Israel has taken steps that shocked many observers. Israel has stationed troops in the mountainous border region to offer support for the Syrian Druze. Israeli forces even fired warning shots at forces threatening the Druze and struck Syria's defense ministry on live TV. And in an even more surprising move, Israel opened its border with Syria, allowing Druze to cross into Syria carrying weapons to help defend their families. This moment didn't come out of nowhere. The Druze have been caught in the crossfire of Middle Eastern rivalries for generations. But to understand why this story matters, why Israel is stepping in now, we need to understand who the Druze are. According to Druze tradition, they're an ancient people, tracing their spiritual lineage all the way back to biblical times. They believe they descend from Jethro. He's the Midianite priest and father-in-law of Moses. His tomb in the Lower Galilee is one of the most sacred sites in the Druze world, and a place of pilgrimage for Druze and others alike. Ethnically Arab, the community's religion traces back to the 11th century in Egypt. They originated as a breakaway movement from Islam. Their leader taught radical new ideas that enraged the Islamic establishment, including a new understanding of reincarnation. This core belief suggests that the Druze of today are all reincarnations of all previous generations of Druze. The teachings were quickly labeled heresy, and the followers of this new religion were forced underground. To this day, the Druze still draw some inspiration from Islam, but they don't identify as Muslim, and Muslims don't consider them part of the Islamic faith. So, what do the Druze believe? It's a tough question to answer because their religion is secret. A secret that's helped the Druze preserve their identity for nearly 1,000 years, especially in times and places where being different could be dangerous. Their insularity and pragmatic politics have kept them safe. The Druze don't accept converts, they don't intermarry, they've never sought independence, and they have obligation to be loyal to their host country. Most Druze are found spread across national borders drawn around them, primarily in Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Lebanon. For generations, the Druze chose to live in remote mountainous regions, far from major cities and power centers. It was a way to protect themselves from the empires, armies, and revolutions that swept through the Middle East, century after century. Survival has often meant staying quiet and separate. That's how they ended up in places like Suwaida in southern Syria and in the Golan Heights, a rocky plateau that today sits on the border between Israel and Syria. The political boundaries drawn around them have resulted in different Druze communities developing distinct identities and histories. But for the Druze in Israel, it's even more complicated. Israeli Druze don't have a single history because the story of the Druze in the Golan and in the Galilee are so distinct. In the early 1900s, the Golan Druze were proud Syrian nationalists. The Great Syrian Revolt against French colonialists began with a Druze rebellion, and Druze revolutionaries are still seen as Syrian national heroes. But at the same time that Syrian Druze were fighting the French, the Druze of the Galilee were in very different circumstances in British Mandate Palestine. Remember, the Druze have obligation to be loyal to their country, but the British Mandate wasn't a country, and by the 1930s, it was clear the British were on their way out of town. With open hostility between Jews and Arabs and no interest in an independent Druze state, the Galilee Druze needed to pick a side, and it wasn't a tough choice. As a religious minority, the Galilee Druze were historically treated with suspicion and hostility by their Muslim neighbors, and so they increasingly cooperated with the growing Jewish communities in the area. Then, in 1948, with the founding of the modern state of Israel, the Druze of the Galilee allied with the Jewish state. They became the only Arab group conscripted into the IDF. At the same time, the Druze in the Golan were serving in the Syrian army, which was officially in a state of armed combat with Israel. And in Lebanon, a country that also saw Israel as an enemy state, the Druze have played a significant role in that country's politics also. The Lebanese Druze most famous leader ran one of the country's major parties and even allied himself with Palestinian militants fighting against Israel. 3 Druze communities suddenly separated by international borders and front lines, loyal to countries engaged in armed combat against one another. But for the Syrian Druze, the story gets even more complicated. Because until 1967, the Druze in the Golan were Syrian, sharing a history with the Druze in Suwaida. But in 1967, everything changed. Egypt and Syria were preparing to invade Israel, but Israel's preemptive strikes caught them by surprise. In a matter of days, Israel tripled in size, including capturing the Golan Heights from Syria. For the Druze living in the Golan, it was as if the ground beneath them had shifted. They went to sleep in Syria and woke up in Israel. And suddenly, their history of political pragmatism was put to the test. Should they accept Israeli rule, stay loyal to Syria, hedge their bets in some way? I mean, they could see how the Galilee Druze had fared in Israel, how their loyalty had paid off. But the Golan Druze had reason to be cautious, because Israel was saying they were willing to give the Golan back to Syria in exchange for peace. And if that happened, any Druze who had collaborated with Israel could face severe consequences. So, as long as Israel only occupied the Golan and the Druze there remained Syrian citizens, for the vast majority, their loyalty stayed with Syria. Incredibly, families separated by the new border found ways to stay connected, crossing the border at times and even shouting family updates to each other through megaphones across the border. But then, in 1981, everything changed again. Israel annexed the Golan Heights and offered citizenship to the Golan Druze, but still, the Golan Druze had reason to distrust Israelis, because at that very moment, Israel was in the midst of a peace agreement with Egypt, dismantling settlements in Sinai and giving that territory back to Egypt. It made sense to think that the Golan might be next on the list of things being given back. The Golan Druze strongly opposed Israeli annexation. There were protests and a labor strike. 90% refused Israeli citizenship, and those who accepted it were seen as traitors. Now keep in mind that while all this was going on in the Golan, in the Galilee, the Druze were Israeli citizens, serving with distinction in the IDF. The Golan and Galilee are separated by less than 100 miles, but the greater chasm is ideological. Yet, over time, things have shifted. In 2000, as part of broader peace initiatives, Israel again broached the idea of giving the Golan back to Syria. A Jewish grassroots campaign exploded onto the scene with the slogan, Ha'am im HaGolan, the nation is with the Golan. Never again has an Israeli leader raised the idea of giving the Golan back to Syria. But many of the Golan Druze still consider Syria home. But in 2011, they looked over the border and saw their homeland erupt into a vicious, armed uprising and a ruthless government crackdown. The Golan Druze could only watch as their homeland was torn apart from the inside. Refugees were streaming out of Syria as the regime struck its own civilians, and ISIS swept through the country, taking the lives of and enslaving non-Muslim minorities. The Golan Druze were no longer hoping to reunite with Syria. Life in Israel was good, while Syria was a bloody mess. And that cleared the way for more Golan Druze to participate more fully in Israeli life. And then, Israel seemed to stab the Druze in the back. In 2018, Israel's ruling coalition passed the nation-state law, which enshrined Jewish self-determination as essential to Israel's character. But it was what was left out of the law that troubled the Druze. The law makes no mention of equal rights for minorities. For the Galilee Druze, who had served faithfully in the military for decades, the omission felt like a betrayal. For the Golan Druze, it was another cause for hesitation in their slow rapprochement with the Jewish state. The attitudes of the Golan Druze towards Israel cooled until one dark day in 2024 changed everything. In the midst of the military confrontation between Hamas and Israel, Hezbollah, ally to Hamas and ally to the Syrian regime, launched a rocket from Lebanon towards the Golan Druze town of Majdal Shams. The rocket hit a soccer field crowded with children. 11 children lost their lives, and scores more were injured. The disparate Druze communities in Israel, Lebanon, and Syria were united in outrage. The Lebanese government feared Lebanese Druze would rise up in revolt. Golan Druze demanded a harsh response from Israel, and Israel obliged. The IDF hit Hezbollah targets across southern Lebanon, and then took out one of Hezbollah's most senior commanders. It was more than just military strategy. Israel was showing the Golan Druze that the Jewish state had their backs. It was a pivotal moment. The Golan Druze finally saw that in the eyes of the Muslims of Lebanon and Syria, they were the enemy, which made the Jewish state their only ally. These complex identities and loyalties are exactly what make this moment in Syria so complicated. The Syrian Druze had helped build modern Syria, from the 1925 revolt to alliances with the secular ruling regime. But after the regime collapsed, after a decade and a half of carnage, the Druze were once again left exposed. As the longtime dictator was driven from power, his allies became targets. The pragmatic approach that had guided the Druze so well for so long appeared to have backfired. The Syrian Druze's local rivals, the Muslim-Bedouin, had aligned with the Islamist militants that overthrew the regime. The Bedouin folded their militias into the new Syrian army, but the Druze, distrustful of these Islamists, did not. That means that when hostility erupted between the Bedouin and the Druze, and the new Syrian president said he was sending troops to restore order, he was sending in the very Bedouin fighters who were threatening the Druze. Islamists who consider the Druze to be a heretical warring tribe. Syria's Druze had only one ally to protect them: Israel. As the situation between Syrian Bedouin and Druze deteriorated, more and more Druze from both sides of the border asked Israel to intervene. Over a few weeks, Israeli forces became increasingly involved in protecting the Syrian Druze from Syrian government forces, and Israel even allowed Golan Druze to cross the border to help defend their Druze cousins. Israel's intervention on behalf of the Syrian Druze is not a simple calculation for Israel or the Syrian Druze. If the Syrian Druze had hoped to work things out with Syria's new government, collaborating with the Zionists against government forces looks pretty bad. But for Israel, there's also an unexpected cost in providing military support for the Syrian Druze. Israel and Syria have been in an official state of armed hostilities since 1948. But Syria's new president, eager to forget past grievances and rebuild his country, has been inching towards making an agreement with the Zionists. Hopes were high, but Israel's striking Syrian forces kind of put a damper on the good vibes. At the same time, it did help generate some good vibes between the Golan Druze and the State of Israel. The community is still far from joining the Zionist team in the way the Galilee Druze have, but they continue to grow closer.